The bells of All Hallows Eve, Inspector Purbright, BBC horror drama. Evening had settled over Flaxborough like a cat finding its corner. Comfortably, without drama. The town's shopfronts glowed with their small lamps. Paper witches and orange lanterns watched the cobbled streets with patient eyes. Somewhere a child, emboldened by sugar and twilight, shrieked a cheerful "boo" before being hushed by his mother. Inspector Purbright, at home in his modest sitting room, stirred a spoon of cocoa with the gravity of a man timing an experiment. The wireless murmured something about a fog warning for the coast. He found it a comfort, fog being one of those things that arrived honestly and left without excuse. Outside, the mist thickened around St. Botolph's church. Its tower, narrow and resigned to age, stood like a keeper of old indiscretions. Few in town noticed when the clock struck 10. But when the hands reached 11, that odd hour of neither night nor morning, the first bell rang. It came not as a chime, but as a call. Clear, solemn, and heavy with distance. Then another followed, and another. The notes rolled across the rooftops, over the market square, and down to the river where the mist lay like sleep. Mrs. Goodby, who prided herself on never believing in nonsense, dropped her knitting. Constable Chubb, patrolling near the post office, froze mid-step and looked up toward the tower. A faint glimmer, like candlelight through fogged glass, winked from the belfry window. "Now what?" he muttered. "In the name of municipal decency is that?" At the vicarage, Reverend Runcorn, half undressed for bed, stopped buttoning his flannel shirt. "The bells?" he said aloud, as though needing to hear it spoken to make it real. His wife, practical and sleepy, murmured that perhaps a draught had caught the mechanism. He did not remind her there was no mechanism, nor any rope fit to pull. By 11:30, the whole town was awake, or at least awake in spirit. Curtains stirred, and windows cracked open just enough for gossip to seep through. The fog swelled thicker, absorbing the sound until even the echo seemed reluctant to fade. Purbright heard it, faint but undeniable, through the pane of his study window. He did not rise nor reach for his coat. He simply listened, brow faintly furrowed. 11, he murmured, and 10 years today. From the mantelpiece, a framed photograph of the late Vicar Henschel looked back at him, caught in a smile both kindly and secretive. Purbright set down his cocoa and, after a long pause, allowed himself a sigh. The bells, it seemed, had found their voice again. But whose voice, he wondered, had they borrowed? Morning crept into Flaxborough as though uncertain of its welcome. The fog still clung to the gutters, grey and patient, reluctant to dissolve into day. By 9 o'clock, the town's usual hum had returned, though softer, broken by the murmuring of those who spoke not of weather or rationing, but of bells at Mrs. Chapman's tea shop. The first customers were already assembled, their voices pitched just below outrage. Mrs. Goodby, restored from her faint, declared she had heard it clear as confession. Her account grew with every retelling, acquiring details of spectral figures and faint chanting that no one had originally mentioned. It was 11 exactly, she insisted, stirring her tea with such force that the teaspoon chimed against the cup. "The very hour he was buried, I checked my clock." Mrs. Chapman, who knew the value of curiosity to her business, sighed sympathetically and refilled the pot. "Perhaps," she said, "the vicar returned to see how his church was being run. I shouldn't blame him. That new sexton gives me the shivers." Across the street, the postmistress, Miss Spindle, was telling her Q that she'd seen a shadowed figure behind the churchyard gate. Her listeners, eager for proof, nodded solemnly. "Couldn't mistake the shape," she added. "Tall, like a man who's been stretched thin by worry." By the time the noon whistle blew from the brewery, the story had become communal property. Children repeated it in sing-song rhyme. Shopkeepers claimed to have heard not just the bells but words beneath them. Only one man did not speak of it at all, Lionel Pratt, the sexton. He arrived late to his duties at St. Botolph's, hat pulled low, coat buttoned high. His usual briskness had deserted him. His steps were heavy, deliberate. When he passed the church railings, a cluster of sparrows took flight, startled by some instinct not shared by people. Inside the vestry, he stood for a moment, listening. The silence was absolute, save for the slow drip of condensation from the roof. He crossed himself awkwardly, as if half forgetting the motion, then began polishing the brass candlesticks with a trembling hand. Inspector Purbright, meanwhile, entered the police station at his usual unhurried pace. Constable Chubb greeted him with that expression peculiar to men who have more to tell than they know how to begin. "Morning, sir," Chubb said, hovering with a sheaf of notes. "You've heard, I expect? About the bells?" "Only from the cocoa tin," Chubb blinked. "Sir?" "Never mind, proceed." Chubb shuffled his notes. "Reports from 6 separate witnesses, all agreeing the ringing began at 11 sharp. No one seen entering or leaving the tower. The vicar says the door's been locked since Easter. No sign of tampering." Purbright took the papers and read them slowly. "And the sexton?" "Claims he was at home. Says he heard nothing." Purbright raised his eyes. "Ah, selective hearing. A common ailment in those close to sanctity." He placed the papers neatly on his desk, then reached for his hat. "I think a stroll might help. Nothing too official. Merely a man appreciating architecture." Flaxborough's architecture, however, was not easily appreciated. It sagged amiably toward the river, its Georgian fronts softened by time and weather. When Purbright reached the churchyard, he paused by the lich gate. The air was damp with the scent of moss and cold stone. The grass, flattened by dew, carried faint footprints leading toward the tower. Not fresh, yet not old enough to ignore. Inside, the nave was dim. Shafts of light, filtered through ancient glass, struck motes of dust that floated like unhurried thoughts. Purbright advanced quietly, his shoes tapping the flagstones in even rhythm. The vestry door stood ajar. Pratt looked up sharply when the inspector entered, his expression momentarily that of a man caught rehearsing guilt. "Ah, Mr. Pratt," said Purbright mildly. "I hope I'm not intruding upon anything sacred." "No, sir. Just keeping the place decent." "A noble calling. I envy the clarity of your occupation. Polish what's dull, replace what's broken. The rest of us have to guess which is which." Pratt's attempt at a smile faltered. "If it's about last night, sir, I know nothing. I lock up proper every evening. I've done since taking over." Purbright studied the man's hands, stained faintly with oil, nails rimmed in soot. "I don't doubt your diligence," he said. "Still, one might imagine a bell rope has a way of slipping free of human attention." "Mechanical mischief, perhaps?" Pratt shook his head. "Ropes were cut years ago, sir." "There's no mechanism left at all." "Ah," Purbright murmured, glancing upward. "And something else must have done the pulling." He left the words hanging, half in jest, half in inquiry. Pratt's eyes shifted toward the narrow stair, curling up into the tower. "You don't think—" he began, then stopped himself. "I rarely think before tea," Purbright replied. "Too dangerous a habit." He moved toward the tower door. The air there was colder, edged with the faint scent of wax and smoke. A candle stub lay against the step, burnt almost to the end. Purbright touched the wax. It crumbled easily. "Old?" Chubb would later ask. "Old enough to be interesting," Purbright would say. But now, in the stillness of the church, he merely pocketed the stub and looked up the spiral of worn stone. Halfway to the bell loft, a sound shifted, a faint metallic sigh like the cooling of iron. He stood for a long moment, listening. Nothing followed. When he emerged again into the daylight, Miss Lucilla Teatime was crossing the green, her parasol tilted against the thin drizzle. She greeted him with the sort of smile one might offer a co-conspirator. "I do hope, Inspector, that you've brought your exorcist's manual," she said. "Flaxborough seems on the verge of spiritual crisis." I doubt it's as serious as that, Miss Teatime. A shortage of reason is rarely fatal. She said, falling into step beside him. Still, people do love a haunting. It gives them a way to talk about guilt without mentioning names. Indeed, said Purbright, almost to himself. And guilt, like fog, tends to linger where the ground is soft. They reached the gate. From somewhere within the church, a faint creak sounded, the lazy hinge of a door closing of its own accord. Miss Teatime raised an eyebrow. Atmosphere, said Purbright calmly. Flaxborough is very rich in it. He looked back once at the tower, its windows blind and grey against the sky. The silence that followed felt deliberate, as though the town itself were holding its breath, waiting for something more. By late afternoon the fog returned, and with it the faint tolling of distant gossip. Each story a little louder, a little stranger than before. And somewhere behind one of those curtained windows, Lionel Pratt sat alone, his face pale in the light of a single lamp, staring at a folded sheet of paper that had been slipped beneath his door. Its message was short, written in a careful, slanted hand. Confess before the next tolling. He read it twice, then a third time, as though the words might change their meaning if watched long enough. Outside, the wind moved through the trees like a whisper trying to remember itself. Morning broke without enthusiasm. The fog had thinned, but only just, hanging in ribbons that drifted across the churchyard like something half-remembered. A thin frost rimed the iron railings. The bells of St. Botolph's stood silent now, and their stillness seemed to make the air itself listen. Inspector Purbright approached the church with the kind of casual interest he reserved for places where people told half-truths with good manners. He carried an umbrella more out of respectability than necessity, and paused by the lich gate to brush a leaf from his coat sleeve. The wooden arch, darkened with damp, framed the tower in a way that made it look taller than memory. Inside, the church smelled of polish and cold stone. The sound of his footsteps travelled a little too far before being swallowed by the walls. He glanced up at the organ loft, the pipes gleaming like regimented sentinels, and smiled faintly. "Fine work, that," he murmured. Lionel Pratt, appearing from the shadows of the vestry, startled like a cat disturbed in its chosen corner. He clutched a cloth in one hand and an oil can in the other, and blinked rapidly, as if deciding whether the inspector's presence was an accident or an omen. "Morning, sir. Didn't hear you come in." "I dare say the church hears little of what it should," Purbright replied, eyes travelling across the nave. "I was told there's been some restoration on the organ. Thought I might admire the craftsmanship. Always had a weakness for machinery that behaves itself." Pratt managed a stiff nod. "Yes, sir. Just tuning and dusting mostly. Volunteers did it. Reverend Runcorn said it pleased the congregation come Christmas. Christmas is a long time to please ahead of schedule." Pratt gave a short, awkward laugh. "That it is." Purbright's attention wandered to the bell tower arch. The door stood closed, the heavy key hanging from its nail beside it. Too neat. Too deliberate. A faint curl of smoke lifted from the floor nearby, the last trace of candle soot clinging to the cold air. "You burn candles during the day, Mr. Pratt?" The sexton froze. "Only for brass cleaning, sir. Better light than the lamps." "Ah, brass does respond to ceremony," said Purbright, almost kindly. "Still, I shouldn't think it likes being near an open flame." He knelt slightly, examining the stone near the base of the door. There, faint but discernible, was a smear of wax, fresh enough to glisten. He touched it lightly, then rose, brushing the dust from his fingers. "Strange thing, Mr. Pratt," he said, turning toward him. "This business of the bells. You've a good lock, I see. Would you mind showing me how it secures?" Pratt hesitated, then lifted the key from its nail. His hand trembled. "Simple bolt inside, sir. Nothing fancy." He fitted the key into the iron lock and turned it with effort. The sound echoed through the nave, too loud for comfort. "Effective," Purbright said softly. "Almost too effective. It would take some determination to disturb what's beyond that door." Pratt avoided his gaze. "Yes, sir." Purbright's voice lightened. "Well, you've reassured me. I shall rest easier, knowing our town's supernatural phenomena observe proper locking procedures." That earned a weak smile, which Purbright accepted with a small nod. He took a slow step toward the front pews, letting the silence settle. "You've been in Flaxborough long, Mr. Pratt?" 6 months, sir. Came from Bransby. Took over when old Tucker passed." "Ah, yes, Mr. Tucker. The man who believed ghosts disliked company. Sensible notion. And before Bransby?" Pratt looked down. "Clerk at Messrs. File and Sons, solicitor's firm." Purbright turned slightly, voice mild. "Legal work to gravekeeping." "A curious change of scenery." Pratt's throat moved as if swallowing a stone. "Needed quiet, sir. Office life didn't agree with me." "I see." Purbright's tone carried neither doubt nor belief, merely thought. "And did you find—" "The quiet?" "Truly?" Pratt gave no answer, only began polishing the already clean brass of a candlestick until it squeaked beneath his cloth. The inspector inclined his head. "Well, don't let me disturb your peace. I imagine the dead prefer their custodian calm." He moved toward the doorway, his step soft against the worn tiles. As he reached the threshold, the great door groaned faintly in its hinges, like an old throat clearing. A breath of chill air slipped past him, smelling of damp wax and thyme. Outside, the churchyard gleamed with dew. Rows of stones leaned slightly as if drawn to each other for gossip. The fog had begun to lift, revealing Miss Lucilla Teatime standing among the graves, her hat trimmed with an entirely unnecessary feather. She appeared to be studying an inscription with great solemnity, or at least performing solemnity with her usual flair. "Good morning, Miss Teatime," Purbright said. "Inspector, you startled me, though I suppose one should expect that in a graveyard." He smiled faintly. "I see you're paying your respects. To anyone in particular?" She lowered her parasol and gave a conspiratorial tilt of her head. "To the dearly departed Mrs. Langtry. She's been resting here some years, though her heirs, it seems, have not rested nearly so well. Have you heard? A small inheritance matter, quite the muddle. I confess I've been distracted by bells." "Ah, but money rings louder, Inspector. Poor Mr. Pratt. He was rather close to the Langtry business, so I'm told. Worked for the solicitors handling it." "One wonders whether ghosts or guilt keep him up at night." "Perhaps both," Purbright said. "They often share lodgings." Miss Teatime smiled, pleased. "And what do you think of our phantom bells? Divine warning or mechanical prank?" "Neither, I suspect." "The dead rarely bother with schedules." "Then you believe someone arranged it?" Purbright turned slightly, looking back at the church tower through the lifting mist. "Let's say I believe the living are infinitely more inventive than the departed, and far less tidy." Miss Teatime's eyes sparkled. "How very reassuring. The supernatural at least has manners." He inclined his head. "Indeed." She closed her parasol with a snap. "Well, I shall leave you to your speculations, Inspector. One mustn't loiter in churchyards. It encourages reflection." "Dangerous pastime," he said, with dry affection. "Good day, Miss Teatime." She drifted away, her heels clicking softly over the gravel. The sound faded into the whisper of the trees. Purbright remained a moment longer, his gaze fixed on the tower's small window. Beneath the sunlight, the stone looked almost kind, almost trustworthy. yet the faintest trace of smoke still curled from the slit in the belfry vent, a ghost of fire refusing to die. He took out his notebook, wrote a single line, candle used where no prayer was said, and closed it gently. Somewhere far off, a clock struck noon, its chime deliberate and unhurried. Purbright turned toward the high street, his thoughts as measured as his step. In Flaxborough the dead were quiet enough. It was the living, he reflected, who made all the noise. By the next morning, Flaxborough had recovered its composure with the efficiency of a cat rearranging itself after a stumble. The previous night's whispers, though still warm, had begun to cool into theories, respectable, manageable theories that could be discussed without embarrassment. At the bakery, Mrs. Goodby declared that it must have been the grammar school boys. "They're always up to mischief, those young terrors," she said, while accepting her change with the air of one offering civic wisdom. "If they can rig fireworks in the headmaster's bicycle, they can rig a bell, I dare say." The idea took root. It was tidy, it was ordinary, and best of all, it was believable without proof. By noon, the council clerk had mentioned it to the vicar. By tea-time, it had reached the mayor's wife, who expressed her relief that no supernatural elements were involved. The following morning, the Flaxborough Chronicle published the conclusion as though it had been established by forensic triumph. Halloween, hoax, schoolboys suspected in church, bell prank. Reverend Runcorn, worn thin by parish inquiries, stood at the lectern that Sunday and assured his flock that no haunting had occurred. He delivered the words with pastoral certainty, though his tone betrayed a quiet fatigue. "We are," he said, "grateful that the mystery was so swiftly explained. Let us hope it brings peace to those who were unnecessarily troubled." Inspector Purbright, seated halfway down the nave, listened without reaction. When the congregation rose to sing, he merely folded his hands, his gaze drifting toward the bell tower window, where sunlight glowed behind the stone tracery like a concealed ember. After the service, he found himself detained on the church steps by a small delegation of parish ladies who wished to thank him for handling the matter so discreetly. He inclined his head, with the politeness of a man indulging. "An amiable fiction, of course," he said. "Discretion is one of our few remaining public virtues." "Then it was the boys?" asked Mrs. Chapman eagerly. "It seems to satisfy everyone," Purbright said. The women nodded, reassured. Satisfied explanations, he knew, were the town's preferred form of closure. Cleaner than truth, and much less trouble as the crowd dispersed. Miss Teatime appeared beside him, parasol resting lightly on her shoulder. "You're very quiet, Inspector. Shouldn't you be pleased to see the matter so elegantly solved?" "Elegance," Purbright replied, "is often what one adds when substance is lacking." She smiled. "So you're not convinced by the grammar school theory?" "I'm fond of those boys," he said. "But not one of them could wind a church bell mechanism that hasn't existed since 1928. They walked a few paces together. The day was pale and windless, and the sound of boots on gravel echoed too clearly. Miss Teatime lowered her voice. "And Mr. Pratt? He looks increasingly unwell, I noticed. A man under strain, conscience?" "Or fear," said Purbright quietly. "Sometimes they resemble each other so closely, even the sufferer can't tell which he's feeling." They parted with a brief nod. Purbright lingered for a moment, watching Pratt lock the vestry door with deliberate care. The sexton's shoulders were hunched, his movements slow, as though each gesture had to be negotiated with himself. When he turned and caught the inspector's eye, he attempted a nod of civility, but his mouth refused to follow. That evening, rain began to fall in small, uncertain drops. The cobbles outside Pratt's cottage glistened, and the wind made the curtains shift against their will. Inside, the room was tidy, excessively so. Every book, every photograph arranged with an anxious precision that hinted at loneliness. The clock on the mantel ticked too loudly, marking out each second with small reproach. He had not lit the fire, though the chill was setting in. Instead, he sat at the small table, staring at the folded newspaper beside his plate. "Schoolboys indeed," he muttered under his breath. His supper, bread and broth, remained untouched. A faint sound broke the quiet. Paper sliding across wood. He looked down. An envelope, yellowish and unmarked, had been pushed halfway beneath the door. The draught must have brought it in, he thought, though he hadn't heard any step outside. For a long time he didn't move. Then, with the caution of someone expecting pain, he reached for it. The flap was sealed, but not securely. When he opened it, a single sheet fell out, its weight almost nothing. There were only 4 words written in a careful hand: "Confess before the next tolling." He stared at the message until the ink seemed to blur. Then he folded the paper again, sharply, as if the act might close the matter. He rose, checked the window latch, and drew the curtain tighter. In the corner, the clock continued its measured ticking. 11 hours until midnight. He told himself it was nonsense, a cruel jest, perhaps, from some boy emboldened by rumour. Yet the back of his neck prickled. He moved to the small dresser, poured a glass of gin, and drank it without tasting. The fire remained unlit. The wind grew louder, filling the silence with its long, uneven sighs. Somewhere far away a church bell chimed the quarter, thin, distant, and innocent. Pratt closed his eyes. He tried to pray, but found no words that seemed suitable for what he had done. The rain had gone by morning, leaving the cobbles slick and the gutters murmuring softly to themselves. Flaxborough woke to a damp brightness, that peculiar light that makes everything appear both newly washed and faintly guilty. Inspector Purbright, crossing the market square, paused to exchange a nod with the florist, who was rearranging chrysanthemums with funereal precision. He had no immediate destination, only a sense that something in the town's recent neat explanation had begun to fray. The bells might have been silenced, the gossip neatly folded away, yet the air still carried a faint vibration, as though the sound had not entirely finished its business. At the corner near the watch repairers, he stopped. The door of Belling & Son, horologists and clockmenders, stood half open, releasing the faint scent of oil and brass. A dozen small clocks ticked inside, each disagreeing slightly with the others, a polite argument of seconds. Behind the counter, old Mr. Belling himself looked up from his magnifying lens. "Inspector Purbright, haven't seen you since your alarm clock went on strike." "An amiable dispute, that," Purbright said. "I never won." Belling chuckled, rubbing his fingers with a cloth. "What brings you, sir? Not another mutinous mechanism, I hope?" "Only curiosity." "You mentioned something to Sergeant Chubb about a visitor last week. Someone asking how to make bells ring unattended." Belling's eyebrows lifted. "Ah, yes, that one. Odd fellow. Middle-aged, nervous type. Came in after hours, nearly closing time. Wanted to know if a clock could be made to pull a rope at precise intervals." Purbright tilted his head. "A curious request." "Indeed, said it was for a pageant demonstration. Something about reviving old customs. But he didn't sound like a man rehearsing a celebration, more like one arranging a confession." "Did he leave a name?" Belling shook his head. "No, sir, only his thanks and a smell of candle smoke on his coat. I told him it could be done with a simple wind and lever mechanism if one had patience and the parts." Purbright glanced toward the workshop shelves, rows of gleaming cogs and gears, each holding a quiet potential for movement. "And did he purchase anything?" "Just a few lengths of brass wire and a spring, paid in exact change." "Exact change is rarely accidental," Purbright murmured. "It implies calculation." He thanked the clockmaker, then stepped back into the street. The afternoon was folding itself toward dusk, the air cool enough to mist his breath. Across the square, the spire of St. Botolph's pierced the fading light, its weathercock gleaming faintly. The sight drew him to the bench beneath the chestnut tree, a vantage where he could see the vestry door without appearing to watch. He waited. Flaxborough moved around him in slow rhythm. A bicycle bell, the clatter of shutters, the gentle argument of pigeons. Beyond these small domestic sounds, the church stood like a sealed confession. At 6:15, the last of the daylight slipped away. Lamps bloomed one by one along the green. Purbright pulled his collar higher, his gaze steady on the tower. Then, movement. A figure crossed the churchyard path, dark against the pale stones, not hurried, not furtive, yet with that deliberate slowness born of nerves. The man paused by the vestry door, glancing once around. Even from a distance, Purbright saw the careful gesture of a key turning, the faintest glimmer of a small lamp lifted inside. The door closed again, soft as breath. The inspector leaned back on the bench. He did not move for several minutes, only listened. From within the church came a sound too delicate to belong to footsteps, a faint metallic adjustment, the tiny complaint of metal upon metal, then silence. He drew his watch from his pocket, winding it absently, as though the motion might echo the one occurring behind those heavy walls. After a while, he rose and crossed the square with the unhurried tread of a man walking off a meal. Near the lich gate, he paused. The faint light from the vestry window trembled, then vanished. He waited, and at last the door opened again. The same figure stepped out, closing it carefully behind him. Even at this distance, Purbright could see the man's face, pale, drawn, as though carrying an argument he dared not conclude. Lionel Pratt turned toward the path and began his walk home, his shoulders slightly stooped, his pace measured and uneven. Purbright remained still until Pratt's silhouette dissolved into the mist. Then he crossed the gravel, stopping before the vestry door. It was locked, of course, properly, firmly. He knelt, tracing a finger over the latch. It was cool and faintly oily. The faintest scent of wax and iron clung there, whispering of candles and mechanisms. And something else, a kind of desperation disguised as industry. From the tower above, a pigeon fluttered, knocking dust from the rafters. It fell in a slow drift through the half-light, settling on his sleeve like forgotten time. Penitence, he murmured softly, brushing it away. Or invention, possibly both. He turned toward the green. The lamps there shimmered through the mist, making small halos in the air. Somewhere a door closed, the sound carrying easily in the stillness. When Purbright reached the station later, Sergeant Chubb was wrestling with the remains of a filing cabinet that had developed a squeak of conscience. "Evening, sir," he said, looking up. "Anything stirring?" "Only the dead, apparently," Purbright replied mildly, hanging his hat. "And perhaps an engineer among them." Chubb frowned. "Sir?" Purbright seated himself, lighting his pipe with deliberate calm. "Suppose," he said, "a man wished to make a public confession. Not in words, but in sound. Suppose he believed that if he could make the past speak aloud, it might absolve him." Chubb scratched his head. "Sounds daft, sir. Bells don't absolve anyone." "No," Purbright said, exhaling a slow stream of smoke. "But they do draw attention." He leaned back, eyes half closed. "If our bell ringer seeks forgiveness, he's chosen an odd instrument for it. Still, people rarely confess for the right reasons. It's usually to relieve pressure, not to admit guilt." "Think he'll try again?" Purbright's gaze drifted to the window, where fog pressed gently against the glass. "Yes," he said at last. "I think he must. Confession is never satisfied with silence. It needs echo." Outside, the town settled toward night. The gaslights hissed softly. The river whispered along its stones. In the dark heart of the church, unseen, a mechanism waited, coiled, patient, exact. And somewhere on the far edge of Flaxborough, Lionel Pratt sat alone at his table, turning a small brass key between his fingers, listening to the faint ticking that would one day measure out his absolution. The next morning arrived without enthusiasm. Flaxborough, as if regretting its brief flirtation with the supernatural, seemed determined to behave itself again. The fog had gone, the air smelt faintly of apples and coal dust, and the church tower looked as innocent as a monument could manage. Inspector Purbright, however, had developed the expression of a man who could hear something faintly off-key in the town's new harmony. He sat in his office with a small stack of papers, a pot of tea, and the quiet patience of one who knows that small towns, like clocks, only reveal their faults when listened to long enough. Sergeant Chubb entered, brushing crumbs from his tunic. "Morning, sir. Got some background on that sexton fellow, Pratt." Purbright looked up mildly. "Ah, I thought you might." Chubb placed a thin folder on the desk. "Worked in Bransby, clerk for File and Sons solicitors. Left sudden like 5 years ago. No record of wrongdoing, but the firm went through a bit of bother around that time. Something to do with a missing will." Purbright poured 2 cups of tea, passed one across. "Missing wills," he said, "are rather like ghosts. They tend to appear where people least want them. Could be nothing, of course," Chubb added. "Might just be bad luck." "Bad luck," said Purbright gently, "is simply guilt that hasn't learned to speak yet." He took the folder, opened it, and read the few lines of neat type. Pratt's references were polite, even complimentary, which, in Purbright's experience, was the surest sign of quiet dismissal. "Fetch me the parish register, if you'd be kind," he said, "and a word with Mrs. Langtry, if she can be persuaded. I believe she's recently taken up the art of remembering old grievances." Chubb hesitated. "The widow Langtry. She's not exactly cooperative." "No one worth listening to ever is," said Purbright, with a faint smile. By mid-afternoon, the inspector was seated in Mrs. Langtry's front room, a place where lace curtains did battle with cigarette smoke, and neither seemed inclined to win. The widow herself sat upright in a chair that looked designed for confession rather than comfort. Her eyes were sharp, and her grief, though aged, had not mellowed. "I don't see what any of this has to do with that nonsense at the church," she said, pouring tea without offering sugar. "I heard the bells same as everyone. My husband would have called it theatrical rubbish." "Your late husband," Purbright said quietly, "was acquainted with the Vicar Henschel, I believe." "He drafted our will, yes. A good man." "Pity the document vanished after his death." Purbright's tone remained conversational. "Vanished?" "Oh, it was found, of course, but not the one we signed. The new version was altered." She gave the word a delicate distaste, as if it tasted of metal. "Certain provisions were missing, certain names omitted. Your husband's relatives benefited." She gave a small, tight smile. "They would say so. I call it theft. But who listens to a widow with no proof?" Purbright studied her for a moment. "And Mr. Pratt, was he employed by the same solicitor?" Her eyes narrowed. "He handled the papers, yes. A careful young man, too eager to please. He called here once or twice. Then, after my husband's funeral, he vanished. Bransby gossip said he'd gone to the church. Found religion, they called it. I call it concealment." She leaned forward slightly, her voice lowering. "If you're asking whether I think he tampered with that will, I'll say this. Men who repent loudly are rarely innocent." Purbright inclined his head. "You think his new occupation is penance?" "I think it's cowardice," she replied. "But then most repentance is." Outside, the clock struck 3. Purbright rose, thanked her for her time, and left her staring into the smoke of her cigarette, which curled upward like the ghost of an unspoken name. He walked back through the town's narrow lanes, his steps measured. Children played marbles near the green, their laughter oddly bright against the dull air. Somewhere a blackbird sang, a defiant sound, clear and untroubled. He stopped at the churchyard gate, resting his hand on the cold iron rail, and looked toward the tower. It stood perfectly still, as though daring him to find motion where none should exist. Miss Teatime appeared beside him, materializing with the natural stealth of a woman who found entrances more satisfying when unannounced. "Inspector," she said warmly, "you have that look again. The one that says something ordinary is about to turn disagreeable." He smiled faintly. "The town does its best to keep me entertained." "I should hope so. I'd hate to think of you growing bored among all this virtue." Purbright looked toward the church door. "Tell me, Miss Teatime, have you ever noticed how those who most crave forgiveness seldom seek it in private?" "Indeed I have. They crave audience more than absolution." "Precisely." They began to walk, their pace unhurried. The grass beneath their feet was damp, and the faint scent of soil rose like old memory. She tilted her parasol thoughtfully. "You think our Mr. Pratt is confessing by bell?" "What a charmingly medieval notion. Confession can take curious forms," said Purbright. "Sometimes it's a letter, sometimes a look, sometimes the careful winding of a clock." Miss Teatime's eyes glimmered. "How often the guilty choose the dramatic rather than the honest," she murmured. "A sermon in sound instead of silence." "Quite," he said, "and Flaxborough does enjoy a sermon." They paused beneath the yew tree near the lich gate. The branches stirred faintly, though there was no breeze. Miss Teatime gave him a sidelong glance. "Will you stop him?" Purbright smiled gently, his gaze still fixed on the tower. "Perhaps not yet. Sometimes it's better to let the guilty complete their performance. It tells you which part they most wished to hide." A faint toll came then, not from the church, but from the town clock across the square, marking the hour with unembellished honesty. The sound rolled over the rooftops, sober and unaccusing. Miss Teatime closed her parasol with a click. "Flaxborough will sleep soundly tonight," she said. "Until someone wakes it again," Purbright replied. And as they walked back toward the square, the last chime faded into the mist, leaving only the whisper of footsteps, steady, deliberate, and knowing. By late October the evenings had grown thick and early, the air heavy with a dampness that clung to coats and memory alike. The leaves in the churchyard lay flattened into the mud, as though bowing before the season. Flaxborough's windows glowed faintly amber through the fog, each light a quiet denial of the dark. Inspector Purbright stood beneath the chestnut tree across the green, collar turned up, breath soft in the cold. It was All Hallows Eve once more, and for the first time in years the town had decided to keep its doors locked. He glanced at his watch. 10:45. The hands, steady and indifferent, moved toward the hour as the mist thickened. The church tower loomed above the lamps, its outline blurred into a shape both familiar and faintly uncertain. Somewhere within, something mechanical waited. At precisely 10 to 11, he crossed the path, his shoes making no sound on the wet gravel. The church door yielded to a key provided by a reluctant Reverend Runcorn, who had muttered blessings over it as if warding off irony. Inside, the nave was dark except for the faint shimmer of candlelight leaking from the tower arch. Purbright paused, allowing his eyes to adjust. The silence was so complete he could hear the faint tick of the clock on his wrist, a reminder of order in a night so eager for superstition. Then slowly he climbed. The stairwell coiled upward in tight stone turns, each step echoing with a soft, metallic tremor. Halfway up, A new sound joined it, the faint, rhythmic whir of gears turning somewhere above. He paused, listening. The machinery purred, then clicked, then fell still. As if aware of his attention, when he reached the bell chamber, he saw it at once. Small contrivance sat beneath the ropes. A curious tangle of brass rods, coiled wire and cogs mounted upon a wooden base. A battery case rested beside it, its wires leading upward to the levers once meant for human hands. The air smelt faintly of candle smoke and hot metal. Purbright crouched beside the device, watching the slow, deliberate movement of one gear as it advanced by fractions toward the next release. Each notch marked time more precisely than any ghost ever could. Beneath the wooden frame, weighted with a stone to keep it still, lay a folded sheet of paper. He lifted it gently, the ink glimmering faintly in the candlelight. "Reverend Henschel," it began, in careful, hesitant writing. "I have tried to live with what I took, but silence has grown heavier than the theft itself. I return the voice to your tower, that it may tell the truth I could not. Forgive me if forgiveness can still be earned. The signature was absent, though the trembling of the hand that wrote it was plain enough." Purbright stood, the note between his fingers. The mechanism gave a faint, metallic sigh, and then precisely at 11 the first bell struck. It was perfect. Not loud, not ragged, but steady and resonant, a sound that filled the air like something newly freed. The next chime followed, then the next, each drawn by unseen fingers. The vibration passed through the floorboards, up through the tower, out into the fog. In the town below, windows opened, curtains stirred. Flaxborough once again was listening. When the 12th stroke faded, there was a sound from the stairwell, the slow tread of a man climbing, hesitant and uneven. Purbright did not move. He turned the paper over once, then tucked it into his coat. Lionel Pratt appeared in the doorway. His face was pale and slick with sweat, though the night was cold. His coat hung open, his eyes fixed not on Purbright, but on the mechanism. "It works," he said quietly, almost to himself. "I didn't think it would, not truly." Purbright regarded him for a moment. "You've given the church back its voice, Mr. Pratt, though I wonder if you meant to awaken the town, or yourself." Pratt swallowed. "I couldn't bear it any more, sir. Every day I walked past this place and heard nothing. I thought, if I could make it speak again, maybe it would drown out the rest. The rest being conscience," said Purbright softly. Pratt's gaze dropped. "I was only a clerk. They told me it was harmless, just a change of names, a few lines retyped. I didn't even see what it meant until afterward. And when Mrs. Langtry came to me, asking what had become of her husband's wishes," his voice faltered, "I told her the papers were lost. I lied to her face. God forgive me, I lied in his name. And this," Purbright gestured to the clockwork, "is your repentance." Pratt nodded weakly. "I wanted to make the bells ring again, to give the church its sound back, to let him know I remembered." Purbright moved closer, his tone even. "Mr. Pratt, guilt is a poor craftsman. It drives a man to build clever contraptions when a simple apology would suffice." The sexton's eyes glistened. "You think confession easy, sir?" "I've tried. I've written it down 100 times. But words fade." "Bells don't." For a moment neither spoke. The only sound was the faint tick of the cooling mechanism and the slow drip of condensation from the beams above. Purbright bent, loosened the wire from the battery, and set the lever still. The machinery gave a soft sigh as though grateful. He turned back. "The law may have something to say, Mr. Pratt, but between you and me I suspect you've already served your sentence." Pratt let out a shuddering breath. Will they forgive me, sir?" "The others?" "Flaxborough," Purbright said, "has an excellent memory for scandal and a very short one for guilt. You'll be forgotten by next Easter." He took the note from his coat, folded it once more, and placed it gently in Pratt's hand. "Best you burn this before someone reads it as poetry." The sexton looked down at it, tears catching the candlelight. As they descended the narrow stair together, the church settled back into its silence. The air was lighter now, though neither man said so. Outside, the fog moved like breath over the stones. Somewhere far away, another bell answered faintly, the town clock striking the half-hour, indifferent and clean. Purbright paused at the doorway, glancing once toward the dark outline of the tower. "Even machines," he said quietly, "have their conscience." "It's the winding that matters," Pratt did not answer. He was staring at his hands, still trembling, as if unsure whether they had built forgiveness or simply revealed its absence. And through the fog, from far off across the green, came the last faint echo of the bell. One solitary note that lingered, then was gone. The church was colder by morning. The mist, having exhausted itself against the tower through the night, had retreated into the hollows of the graveyard, leaving behind a silver dampness that filmed every stone. Inside, the air still carried the faint tang of candle smoke and brass. A scent of contrition, thought Purbright, mixed with engineering. He stood by the vestry window, watching the square beyond blur slowly into light. Behind him, Lionel Pratt sat at a small wooden table, his hands folded, his face pale with the kind of exhaustion that comes not from sleeplessness, but from relief. Between them, the small clockwork contraption rested on its wooden base, silent now except for the faint, residual ticking that clung to its cogs, a dying echo of the night's confession. Purbright drew his notebook from his pocket, but did not open it. He preferred the quiet. "You understand?" he began mildly. "That curiosity in such matters isn't the same as accusation. The law will need an account, of course, but I'm more interested in the reason than the method. People seldom build things like this without purpose." Pratt nodded slowly, his eyes, rimmed with red, fixed on the mechanism as though it might still demand maintenance. "It wasn't meant to frighten anyone, sir. Truly. I wanted to make something right, or at least less wrong." Purbright's voice remained gentle. "And what precisely did you imagine would be set right by a bell tower that rings itself?" Pratt hesitated, his gaze drifting toward the narrow slit of daylight above. "You wouldn't believe me. I've believed odder things before breakfast." The faintest ghost of a smile passed across Pratt's face, quickly gone. "When I was at File & Sons, we handled estates, wills, deeds, the paperwork of people's endings. I thought of it as holy work in a way, though there was no altar. One day the vicar's will came through. Reverend Henschel, you'll have heard of him." Purbright inclined his head. "A man of much sermon and little punctuation, if I recall." "Yes. He'd left something generous to Mrs. Langtry, nothing scandalous, a token, a kindness. But after he died, a new version appeared, the bequest gone, his name and memory left tidy, untouched." Pratt rubbed his hands together, as though feeling the grit of that memory still between his fingers. "They said it was his wish." "I knew better. You made the change?" "I was told to, by Mr. File himself. He said the vicar's first draft was sentimental nonsense and that Mrs. Langtry's claim would cause talk. He handed me the typed page and said, 'Copy it, Pratt. Use the old letterhead. We'll file the revision and destroy the rest.' And you did?" He nodded, without question. I told myself it was procedure, nothing more. But after the widow came, after she asked what had happened, I saw it for what it was. Theft. Only it wasn't money I'd stolen, was it? It was faith. He leaned forward slightly, voice unsteady. The vicar trusted me to keep his word safe. And I betrayed that, for the sake of appearance. Purbright's expression softened, though his tone remained precise. And all this time, the weight of that single page kept you from peace. Pratt gave a faint laugh, brittle as frost. At first I thought I could pray it away. Then I thought I could forget. but the silence became unbearable. Every Sunday I stood beneath those bells, the same ones that tolled for him, and I imagined they were waiting.
I suppose I wanted them to speak what I couldn't. Purbright looked at the mechanism.
So you made a machine to perform confession on your behalf? I wanted to hear him again, Pratt said quietly. Not the man, perhaps, but the sound, his voice in those bells, the forgiveness I couldn't ask for. And when they rang, Purbright said, did you feel it? Pratt's fingers twitched. For a moment,
it was beautiful, like
air being let into a sealed room. But then it stopped, and I was still here. The ticking of the mechanism faltered, one last gear completing its circle before falling silent altogether. The sound, when it ceased, was strangely final. Purbright stepped closer to the table, examining the contrivance without touching it. Ingenious, he murmured. A clock turned confessional. Flaxborough rarely manages innovation in sin. Pratt gave a small, strained laugh, then pressed a hand to his temple. I didn't want spectacle, sir.
Only truth.
But truth doesn't come quietly, does it? It wants an audience, usually, said Purbright.
Otherwise we'd have no churches. He walked to the window, resting his hand against the cold glass.
Outside, the fog had thinned enough to show the square, the faint outline of Miss Teatime's parasol among the early shoppers. When people hear those bells again, he said, they'll speak of hauntings, warnings, maybe even miracles. You'll have given them a fine story. I didn't want a story, Pratt whispered. Just silence, the kind that forgives. Purbright turned back to him. You've had that silence for years, Mr. Pratt. It didn't forgive you then. It won't start now. The sexton lowered his head. His shoulders trembled, though not with fear. What will happen to me? Purbright's tone remained gentle. Likely a hearing, possibly a fine. The vicar and the council will mutter, and the town will talk. But not for long. They'll move on. It's their one reliable virtue. Pratt's gaze lifted. And you, sir? What do you think of me? Purbright regarded him steadily. I think you mistook guilt for virtue. It's an honest error shared by most of the devout. He closed his notebook at last, though it was still empty. I'll speak with the vicar before the papers do. Best to let your confession stay where it belongs, among those who understand the value of locked doors. Pratt nodded faintly, and the quiet between them grew large enough to feel. The inspector moved toward the door, then paused, glancing once more at the mechanism on the table. You know, he said, there's something rather noble in trying to give voice to remorse.
Even if it does require a battery. A flicker of rueful pride touched Pratt's face.
It took me weeks to get the timing right, he said softly. The chime had to fall exactly on the hour. He would have wanted that. Purbright smiled almost kindly. No doubt. The Almighty, too, is said to be punctual. He stepped out into the cold. Behind him, the church door closed with a muted echo. The fog had begun to lift entirely now, thinning into threads that caught the pale light. Somewhere a robin sang, tentative but determined. Purbright paused by the gate, drawing on his gloves. The bells of St. Botolph's stood mute against the sky. Yet, for an instant, he could almost imagine the faintest vibration still lingering in the air. Not a ghost's cry, not quite machinery, but something human. The sound of conscience settling back into silence. By afternoon the fog had cleared entirely, leaving Flaxborough exposed beneath a thin and unflattering light. The streets, washed clean by the night's damp, seemed sharper, the buildings a little more honest in their angles. At the police station, the kettle had just begun its weary whistle. Inspector Purbright sat at his desk, sleeves rolled, sorting through a modest tower of paperwork that threatened, as ever, to collapse under its own dull weight. The clock on the wall ticked with officious regularity, the only sound, until Miss Lucilla Teatime appeared in the doorway, escorted by a constable whose expression suggested both admiration and mild confusion. I told this charming young man, she said, that I bring neither complaint nor confession,
Merely curiosity, and which in Flaxborough
Is probably the same thing. Do come in, Purbright replied without looking up. You'll find curiosity quite at home here. It shares a shelf with regret. She entered, her perfume softening the air, and glanced at the papers on his desk. You've been busy. Bureaucracy, said Purbright, is the town's method of exorcism. It gives the illusion that the untidy has been tidied. From the side office came the sound of Chubb wrestling the kettle onto its tray. He appeared a moment later, slightly flushed, balancing 3 mismatched cups and a dented teapot that seemed to resent its duty. "Tea? Sir!" he announced, as though the declaration itself were an achievement. "Heroic," said Purbright. "It's tea time. Milk first, I believe." "You remember everything except birthdays," she said, settling herself gracefully opposite him. Purbright poured. "Well, birthdays are for optimists. Now, I expect you've already heard the town's version of last night." "I have," she replied. "It's become rather lyrical. The bells rang to summon lost souls, and poor Mr. Pratt is being spoken of as both saint and lunatic."
"I imagine the truth is less satisfying." "Considerably," said Purbright.
He stirred his tea with careful indifference. The mechanism was his doing, a clockwork contraption powered by guilt and batteries.
Ingenious in a way, though it's unlikely to earn him a patent. Chubb, who had taken a cautious sip of his tea, grimaced.
"He won't go to prison, will he, sir?"
"Doesn't seem the criminal sort, just—"
Troubled, Purbright leaned back in his chair. "The law must not, of course. Forgery, tampering, deception, and the small matter of disturbing the peace. But it would be absurd to punish him for honesty delivered too late. Prison, Chubb, is for those who sleep well at night." Miss Teatime smiled faintly over the rim of her cup. "And yet, Inspector, you have the air of a man unconvinced by redemption." "On the contrary," he said, "I find it endlessly entertaining. Redemption, like guilt, is most effective when properly performed." She raised an eyebrow. "Performed?" "Ah, you've seen it often enough, Miss Teatime. The town's fondness for a public moral, the tidy closure. They'll call Pratt pitiful, then pious, then forget him altogether. The rhythm never changes." She considered this, then said softly, "Flaxborough has always preferred a little guilt to a great scandal." "Indeed," said Purbright, with dry amusement.
"A national trait."
"We like our sinners mild and our confessions brief." Chubb set down his cup, frowning. "But it's strange, sir. Why build the whole thing at all? Why not just admit it and be done?" "Because," said Purbright, "confession in words demands courage. Confession in craft only demands skill. And Pratt, poor man, was better with gears than conscience." The clock ticked on, filling the silence that followed. Outside, the sound of a motor car drifted faintly along the high street, fading into distance. Miss Teatime folded her gloves neatly beside her.
"So what happens to him now?"
"He'll be charged formally," said Purbright. "The magistrate will sigh, the papers will print a small paragraph on page 3, and Mrs. Langtry will at last be able to describe herself as vindicated. Then perhaps he'll sleep." "Do you think he will?" she asked. "No," said Purbright after a pause. "But he'll try."
"And that's as close to absolution as most of us manage," she smiled faintly.
"You sound almost ecclesiastical, Inspector." He gave a dry shrug. "In Flaxborough, one can't avoid it. Every crime here comes with a sermon attached." Chubb cleared his throat.
"You think anyone else was in on it, sir? That solicitor fellow File?"
Purbright looked up at him, eyes thoughtful. "Ah, Mr. File, yes, there's a ledger somewhere with more truth than accounts. But he's retired now, and the past, like fog, is rarely arrested." Chubb nodded, chastened. "Still seems unfair, sir." "Fairness," said Purbright, "is a modern invention." "I wouldn't rely on it." Miss Teatime set down her cup. "You know, Inspector, there's something rather English about the whole affair. Guilt expressed through craftsmanship. We might yet open a museum." "Admission free," Purbright murmured. "Donations accepted in silence." They shared a quiet smile, the sort that carried no amusement, only understanding. Chubb, sensing the conversation's end, busied himself with the teapot. though its contents had long since surrendered. The clock chimed the hour. 3. Purbright stood, stretching slightly, and crossed to the window. Outside, the town looked deceptively calm. Postmen walking their rounds, children trailing behind prams, the ordinary miracle of life resuming. The church tower, visible between rooftops, was dark against the pale sky. He spoke without turning. There's something reassuring about it, isn't there, Miss Tea Time? The way everything continues. Bells fall silent, papers are filed, yet the world insists on carrying on as if absolution were routine. Perhaps it is, she said quietly. Perhaps we've mistaken habit for forgiveness. Purbright smiled faintly. Then Flaxborough is truly blessed. He returned to his desk, picking up his pen. While the report won't write itself, guilt rarely does. Miss Tea Time rose, smoothing her coat. If you ever tire of the police inspector, the pulpit would suit you. I prefer my sermons unsupervised, he said. They require fewer amends. She paused at the door, the faintest gleam of amusement in her eyes. Until next scandal, then, he bowed his head slightly. Or next redemption. When she had gone, the office felt quieter, though not emptier. Chubb stacked the cups, still uncertain whether he'd witnessed justice or something adjacent to it. Purbright returned his gaze to the paper before him, its top line waiting patiently. Case of the St. Botolph's bells. He hesitated, then began to write in his measured hand. Not about ghosts or guilt or mechanism, but about the quiet machinery of conscience that had set them all in motion. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the faintest, most ordinary sound of all, the clockmaker's hammer, tapping rhythm back into order. Sunday arrived with a soft drizzle that blurred the edges of things. Trees, gravestones, memory. The churchyard smelled of damp grass and lilies long past their prime. Inside St. Botolph's, Reverend Runcorn stood before his congregation, his voice measured, the kind of tone that hoped not to wake discomfort. He had chosen, as Purbright later remarked, a sermon light on theology and heavy on sympathy. For the peace, the vicar intoned, of those troubled in spirit, for the souls who carry burdens unseen, and for those whose conscience weighs more than their wrongs. The congregation bowed their heads dutifully. Some closed their eyes with genuine piety, others simply to avoid glancing at the empty pew near the back, where Lionel Pratt had always sat. The morning light filtered through the windows, muted and grey. When the organ sighed its closing chord, the congregation rose with polite relief. Outside, umbrellas bloomed along the path like dark flowers. People spoke softly as if the mist itself might eavesdrop. Mrs. Goodby confided to Mrs. Chapman that it was a mercy.
Really? Such a gentle madness. The baker's wife called it a sad business, but good-hearted in its way. Someone else remarked that Flaxborough always did prefer its scandals mild. Purbright,
standing by the lich gate, listened without appearing to. The vicar joined him a moment later, wiping his spectacles. I suppose, Runcorn said, it's over then. The bells will stay quiet. Until someone else decides silence is unbearable, Purbright replied. You may wish to oil the locks, Runcorn sighed. Poor man. I can't decide whether to pity or admire him. Both, said Purbright. It saves time. They parted on that note, each man walking into the mist with equal grace. By Monday, the story had softened. Pratt, they said, had resigned of his own accord. He'd taken the early train to Bransby, leaving behind his tools and a neatly folded cassock. The porter at the station remembered him only by his hands, trembling as he counted out the fare. The platform clock struck 7, and the train slipped into the fog, carrying with it a man who had mistaken contrition for redemption. Back at St. Botolph's, Chubb supervised the removal of the automaton. "Strange little beast," he muttered, holding the brass frame up to the light. All that trouble just for a bit of noise. Purbright, who had come to watch, smiled faintly. Noise, Sergeant, is the one thing conscience cannot bear to make quietly. Chubb looked puzzled, but nodded all the same. The machine was dismantled, its pieces boxed and labelled as evidence, though no one imagined they'd ever be needed again. The bell tower returned to its stillness, the ropes hanging slack, the air clear of ghosts. For a week, Flaxborough spoke of Pratt with admirable restraint. Shopkeepers remembered him as a quiet man, perhaps too serious. The postmistress declared that he always paid on time. Mrs. Langtry, upon being informed that her late husband's bequest had likely been forged by the same trembling hand, said only that she would pray for him. Though whether for his soul or her own satisfaction, no one asked. By Friday the talk had thinned. There were sales to discuss, weather to lament, and a promising rumour about a new grocer on Bridge Street. The past, like fog under sunlight, had lifted and gone. In his office, Purbright sat with his report open before him. The typewriter waited, keys clean and expectant. He tapped one thoughtfully, then began to type in his deliberate, unhurried rhythm. Subject: Lionel Pratt. Late sexton, St. Botolph's Church. Nature of case: disturbance by unauthorized activation of bells, mechanical. Details: mechanism devised and installed by subject without supervision.
No damage or injury.
Motivation uncertain. He paused, the cursor blinking like a question. Then, with a small nod to himself, he continued. Probable cause: remorse manifesting as theatre. Recommendation: no further action. Conscience has concluded its own proceedings. He signed his name, capped his pen, and leaned back. Through the half-open window drifted the faint sound of the market square. Voices, the clatter of crates, the hum of ordinary life resuming. Miss Teatime appeared, unannounced as ever, carrying a paper bag and an expression of genteel amusement.
"I thought you might need sustenance," she said.
"Currant buns, from the bakery that swears its ovens are blessed." "Then I'll risk two," said Purbright, accepting the bag. "They'll serve as evidence that goodness occasionally sells by the dozen." She smiled. "The town seems calmer today."
"No more tolling at midnight?"
"None. Even guilt tires eventually." She settled into the chair opposite his desk, removing one glove with a deliberate grace. "Do you think he'll find peace wherever he's gone?" Purbright considered. "Peace rarely travels well, but perhaps he'll find quieter regrets." They shared a silence, the sort that required no filling. From outside came the faint sound of the town clock striking the half-hour, clear, untroubled, and perfectly ordinary. Miss Teatime rose, smoothing her sleeve. "You know," she said lightly, "Flaxborough owes you a debt. You've preserved its dignity once again." "Ah," said Purbright. "Dignity? That fragile substitute for honesty," she smiled. "Then until the next performance, Inspector." He inclined his head. "There's always a next performance. Humanity doesn't close between acts." When she had gone, he sat for a moment longer, the room warm with the scent of tea and rain. He opened his notebook, scribbled a final line beneath the report, and underlined it once. Remorse is merely guilt with manners. Outside, the wind turned a page of the day, and in the distance, the church bells, silent for a fortnight, gave a single accidental chime, as if to remind Flaxborough that even its quietest hours were never entirely still. Winter came quietly, as it always did in Flaxborough, not as a storm or a reckoning, but as a slow tightening of the air, a dimming of colour, a faint sigh that moved through the hedgerows and the chimneys alike. Frost stitched its thin embroidery across window panes, and the mornings carried that particular stillness in which breath seemed like trespass. Inspector Purbright found the change agreeable. The town, under its soft hush of cold, behaved itself better. Even the gossip seemed to move at half speed, as though chilled by politeness. St. Botolph's bells remained silent, their tongues resting in patient rust, and if anyone mentioned Lionel Pratt, It was in the same tone used for weather no longer worth discussing. The inspector's days fell into their old rhythm. Mild inquiries, small absurdities, the tender bureaucracy of a place that never quite believed in crime but liked to rehearse for it. Miss Teatime, still resplendent in her winter furs, brought occasional intelligence from the high street and once delivered, with theatrical gravity, a sprig of holly to keep out moral frost. Chubb continued to wrestle with reports and with the mystery of paperwork that multiplied without human assistance. And Purbright, in his unhurried way, remained what Flaxborough needed him to be, a quiet observer keeping watch over a town that imagined itself perfectly ordinary. Evening came early now. The lamps along the market square flickered into life before the last shop shutters had finished closing, casting their amber light onto pavements slick with frost. The sound of boots on cobblestones carried far in the still air, as though distance itself had decided to listen. On one such evening, Purbright walked his usual route along the river path and across the green. The grass crackled faintly underfoot. Ahead, the church tower rose against the dim blue of twilight, its outline clear and spare. A thin plume of smoke from the vicarage chimney drifted sideways on the wind, dissolving before it reached the first stars. He paused by the churchyard gate. The iron was cold beneath his gloved hand, and the latch gave its small, familiar protest as he leaned on it. The graves lay in neat, frosted rows, each stone softened by a dusting of white. The place had the calm of things finally settled. From somewhere beyond the trees came the faint rustle of leaves, or perhaps only the whisper of the wind moving through the yew branches. It carried with it a sound so slight, so fleeting, that for an instant he thought he heard them again. The bells. Not the clamour of the haunted night, nor the measured toll of repentance, but a softer echo, almost shy, a breath of memory finding its own harmony with the cold. He stood very still, listening. The air offered nothing more, only the hush of winter and the slow, even beat of his heart. After a moment, he smiled. Not widely, his expressions were never extravagant, but with a quiet acceptance. He knew it was only the wind, perhaps striking the loose clapper of one forgotten bell, or perhaps nothing at all. Still there was comfort in it, for what was conscience, if not a kind of music? The faint reverberation of what once was wrong, reminding the living that silence too can be heard. He straightened, brushed a trace of frost from his coat sleeve, and began to walk back toward the square. The lamps ahead glowed warmer now, drawing him gently toward them. In a few windows he saw the pale flutter of curtains, the shimmer of a Christmas tree's first attempt at cheer. Somewhere, faintly, a gramophone played a dance tune just a little too slow. The inspector walked on, his breath rising in calm clouds, the frost crunching softly beneath his steps. When he passed the bakery, he saw that the window was already dressed for the season. Loaves arranged like offerings, a little card proclaiming peace on earth. 2 shillings a loaf. He paused, looked at it for a moment, and smiled again, though this time with amusement. Peace, he reflected, was not cheap anywhere. At the corner, Miss Teatime emerged from the fog, wrapped in a scarf of improbable elegance.
"Inspector," she said, as though she'd been waiting for him.
"You do realize you're walking without any visible purpose? It alarms people. Then I'll do it more often," he said. She laughed softly. "You've heard the gossip, I suppose. They say the church will replace the bells entirely. Modern ones electric. No ropes, no ghosts, no conscience." Purbright looked toward the tower, its shape fading back into mist.
"Ah," he said.
"Progress. A convenient cure for memory." She tilted her head. "You'll miss the sound, though. Admit it?" "Perhaps," he said. "But I expect guilt will find another instrument." Miss Teatime smiled, the kind that warmed the cold air briefly. Flaxborough will sleep soundly tonight. It will, he agreed. But dreams have excellent hearing. She gave him a look that might have been fondness or mischief or both. Then good night, Inspector. Good night, Miss Teatime. She vanished down the lane, her footsteps dissolving into the frost. Purbright lingered a moment longer, gazing toward the tower's shadowed outline. There was no sound now but the wind through the trees, steady, patient, unjudging. Yet as he turned for home, he fancied that just beyond hearing, the faintest note lingered, not a bell, not a ghost, but something older and quieter, a whisper of the town's conscience gently humming to itself. He walked on, hands in his pockets, head bowed slightly against the cold, and Flaxborough, as it had always done, carried on around him, calm, courteous, and faintly amused by its own mysteries. Thanks for watching the video. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. The end.